Hey everybody! Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to our next episode in the Season 2 finale series of the It's Not Scary, It's Just Music podcast, in which we're recapping the entirety of the 90s major genre group by major genre group. In today's episode, we're going to be talking all about Western pop music. In the prologue for the 90s recap series, I had mentioned that I was going to split out the popular pop music in the West and the underground pop music in the West, and I just decided to just do one episode about both at the same time. So, as a reminder, this is an entire series of episodes or smaller episodes in which I'm going through these major buckets of genres in order to help paint the picture of what was happening in the 90s across the entire decade. So, in this particular episode, we're just going to be talking about Western pop music, but there are other episodes in this series in which we're talking about other genres like electronica or underground rock music or metal or rap or what have you. So, make sure that you check out all of those episodes in the series so you get the whole picture of what's going on in the 90s. Additionally, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I talk about in today's episode, feel free to find the link to that essential playlist, which is linked in the description of today's episode. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to review what we recapped in the 1980s for Western pop music. And then next, we're going to overview the subgenres we'll be hitting today. And then finally, we're going to dive into each subgenre with milestone songs across the decade and why. So to start off with, in the 1980s recap, the pop songs that we used to elicit the trajectory from the very beginning of the 1980s all the way up until the end started with Private Eyes by Hall & Oates, and then Lucky Star by Madonna, then Higher Love by Steve Winwood, and then finally, Express Yourself, also by Madonna. And as I recall, the main talking point that we had highlighting the entire macro trend of Western pop music in the 1980s was that it progressively became more about tapping into who you are as a person, empowering the listener to be more of themselves, to find that inner strength. Obviously, with Madonna's Express Yourself, there was a very clear and obvious degree of her telling her fans and listeners all over the world that they needed to be who they are and be themselves, and that it's okay to be that person because you are a unique individual and you should just express yourself and be more open and honest with who you are, and people will appreciate you more for it, Madonna specifically included. In addition to that, which we didn't talk too much about and we'll go into greater depth as we move along here into the 90s, is that the dance inclusion started to go up and up and up as we, interestingly enough, pivoted away from what was happening with Private Eyes, which had more of an R&B vibe to it and was very clearly walking away from disco. But by the time we got to the end of the 80s, Madonna was starting to infuse ideas that eventually became akin to house ideas, which we had talked about pretty extensively at the very beginning of season 2. So Madonna's Express Yourself did have quite a few markers of house music, again, that I don't think we necessarily called out in great detail either in the 80s recap or when we talked about Madonna's Express Yourself over the course of season 1. But it was actually, interestingly enough, quite the launch pad to, at the very least, dance pop, and to a certain extent, Euro dance pop in the 90s, which we'll talk about here as we start to move along. So as we're moving away from the 1980s, let's talk a little bit more about the subgenres that we're going to be touching on today. So as I said a second ago, we're going to talk about dance pop and then Euro dance pop, which both are obviously Western, but Euro dance pop has its own flavor, and we'll talk about what that means here when we get to it. Jangle pop, dream pop, alternative pop, and indie pop. So to start off with, let's talk a little bit about dance pop. So a second ago, we mentioned how Madonna's Express Yourself was a really clear launch pad into what dance pop would eventually be because it starts to incorporate house music, which was becoming very popular in the late 80s, early 90s. You might think back to either the electronica recap in this 90s recap series or thinking back to the 1990 episode of season 2 and thinking about songs like Everybody, Everybody by Black Box. So Madonna's Express Yourself sounds like it could have very easily been played right up against songs like that in the nightclubs at the time. Interestingly enough, Madonna had already become quite the gay icon, and so because of that, her leaning more into those house sounds was very prophetic in many ways because she was just leaning into that culture and what was going on there. And Express Yourself certainly could have been an anthem to the everyday pop culture clientele and listener from kids to adults, but then also a little bit was a veiled tap into gay culture too, and talking about them living out their biggest, best self and not being afraid to be who they are and not hiding away in underground society and expressing yourself. So it was an interesting launch pad into what dance pop would become going forward. So how do we define dance pop in this case? So dance pop is a couple different things. In the beginning of the 90s, at least, it starts off as being music that could be interchangeable with house music. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two. Euro dance pop kind of has that same issue, but later. But at least in straight ahead dance pop, you can dance to it, certainly. But also, as you can see with most Madonna songs in the latter half of the 80s, going into the 90s and so forth, and then going into the 90s beyond Madonna, most of these dance pop tracks also have a fairly distinctive dance routine that exists within a music video, for example, that goes along with the music itself. So dance pop in this case is both the fact that you yourself could dance because it's got an upbeat rhythm to it and you can dance and groove with it personally, or there's a distinctive dance routine that goes with it. So the artist themselves is dancing while they're singing the song. So diving into the details here, we're going to start off with Touch Me by Kathy Dennis on her album Move to This, which came out in 1990. And we talked about this album during the 1990 episode of season 2 of the podcast. So the reason that this is starting things off, there's a couple reasons behind it. One is that Madonna at this point was starting to leave behind her 80s persona in this moment and launched up with Express Yourself and inevitably obviously got to Vogue, where she was leaning even more into tapping into the gay icon status, because Vogue is obviously a direct reference to the idea of voguing or balls in drag culture. So Madonna was going on that journey in this moment. And Kathy Dennis in 1990 with Touch Me was very much so connecting herself to the sound of Madonna, at least with Express Yourself and whatever was to come directly thereafter. Touch Me has a very house adjacent sound to it. It very much sounds like anything that you would have found in the club in the very beginning of the 90s. It sounds like everybody a little bit. And to that end, it's got teeny, tiny little markers of R&B influence into it, but not too much. It's mostly whatever R&B influences house music has. This song and Kathy Dennis taps into maybe even 50% of even that much. So it's barely noticeable, but it is there nonetheless. And it is very dancey. It's got a very dancey rhythm to it. You could find it in a club. And like I said a second ago, it has many parallels to house music combined with Madonna of a couple years ago. So Kathy Dennis is clearly moving the trend forward with dance pop by really just taking Madonna ideas and adding a couple extra things to them, and there we are. So there's a lot more that happens here that is of a fairly low quality for the most part, with the exception of, Madonna popping up with Vogue, that this whole entire genre kind of goes underground a little bit in favor of other ideas, for example, like Eurodance pop that starts to take over the airwaves. So the idea of traditional dance pop just gets pretty quiet after a while, almost immediately, honestly, after this album comes out. And then in 1995, Robyn comes out with Do You Know What It Takes on her album Robyn Is Here, and that's in 1995. And the interesting thing about this is that this could be construed as Eurodance pop because she is from Europe, so this isn't just American style traditional dance pop, or even UK style. So when we think of Western dance pop, one would say something in the UK or something in the United States, and this is neither because Robyn is Scandinavian. So because of that, she's taking a lot of those Eurodance pop ideas, and what's actually happening here is where Touch Me by Kathy Dennis in 1990 is much faster, it's got a charging beat to it, and it's just kind of churning, and it sounds very dancey like you would find it in the club. Do You Know What It Takes by Robyn is slowed way down. It's about 30% as fast as Touch Me is, which as a result is far slower than Madonna was on Express Yourself, even on Vogue in the early 90s. This is even slower than that. And you can hear it's just a very steady beat, and there's a little bit more R&B going into it than previously. Now, it's not going to be straight ahead R&B, because if you were to create a Venn diagram between this and R&B, it might share 0.5% in the middle, but there's markers of it. Like the way that Robyn sings is a little bit R&B-esque. I think that one could make the argument that some of the beats are R&B adjacent. The melodies, again, a teeny tiny, barely noticeable fraction is R&B style. really the punchline to Do You Know What It Takes by Robin as a juxtaposition to Kathy Dennis's Touch Me is it barely sounds dancey the way that Touch Me is, because you could very clearly dance to this, but in Do You Know What It Takes, you're more bouncing to this. You're grooving a little bit, kind of like you would be doing with R&B, and it's a little bit more intense. And so it's not necessarily just kind of skating across and just moving and moving and moving and dancing like Touch Me is. But Do You Know What It Takes is just very intentional. It's very intense. And you could really tease out all the words that Robin is singing about here. In another way, you could think about it as being very simplified. It's been scaled down and simplified considerably from 1990. And the interesting thing too about this is that considering the derivations of this song are more Euro dance pop than regular dance pop, it's slowed down even more than that, because the trajectory of Euro dance pop, which we'll talk about here in a minute, is that it actually gets faster and faster and faster and dancier and dancier and dancier. So the interesting thing about non-Euro dance pop, so traditional dance pop or however you want to define it, gets just slower and slower and slower. So it's interesting that one goes faster over time and one gets slower over time. And the best way to capstone this point is in 1999 when Britney Spears came out with Baby One More Time on her album Baby One More Time. It's even slower than Do You Know What It Takes. It's very, some might even say plodding. It's very slow paced. It's very intense. It's very clear. And the dancey components are more R&B-esque because the song goes so slow. Like it really just kind of strolls along. I would even say that Robin's Do You Know What It Takes was a little bit of a stroll, maybe a trot, where Kathy Dennis's Touch Me was a nice jog. Baby One More Time is a very slow, sultry walk. And so because of that, it's painting this really interesting picture about dance pop, where if you think about if Madonna's Express Yourself at the very end of the 80s was the beginning of all of this, that the trajectory took this really weird winding path where Madonna's Express Yourself was very dancey and certainly sexy in its own way. And then Kathy Dennis's song Touch Me, also sexy to a certain degree, but it was more like we're sexy in the club. This is gone from being sexy to being sultry, and it's just intriguing. It's an intriguing trajectory that's been taken with dance pop, where you can certainly dance to this a little bit, but for the most part, you're watching the artist dance and you yourself maybe grooving, but you're probably not dancing nearly as much. Like Baby One More Time probably needed to get remixed before it was going to find its way into the club, and I'm pretty sure that it did and has been for eons since then. So it's a very interesting trajectory that dance pop took over the course of the 90s, where it just, again, it got slower and slower and slower and went away from being sexy and turned into being more sultry. Just interesting. So juxtaposed to that, on the Eurodance pop side, in the 80s, pop music that was coming out of Europe was more on the synth pop side. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of dance pop that was going on. There was a bit, but it really took hold of the synth pop ideas. And so because of that, there was some dancing. Obviously, discotheques were alive and well in Europe in the 80s, so it's not like they weren't. But it was more about the synth music and less about Euro dance house related music that we know of Euro dance pop to be over the course of the 90s going into the 2000s, certainly. So what do we mean by that? In 1993, Ace of Base came out with All That She Wants on their album The Sign, which was wildly, insanely popular, and many believe or perceive was a birthing point to all of the Western interest in Euro dance pop or Euro pop or anything like that. Like all these other artists started to come out of the woodwork from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe and the like, due to the success of the album The Sign by Ace of Base, because All That She Wants was one of maybe 4 huge hits for them on that album, so it was a big moment. The interesting thing about this track is that kind of lining up All That She Wants with, let's even just say Robin's Do You Know What It Takes, or even Baby One More Time, they are about on the same pace. I think All That She Wants is probably a little bit slower than Baby One More Time, maybe. Their tempo is about in the same place though. And if you juxtapose that to Touch Me by Kathy Dennis, that was 1990. This is 1993, All That She Wants. The music is just really slow, which is super interesting. Why it went that way, I'm not 100% sure. I probably could have done more research to understand why that happened, but if nothing else, I'm listening to this music and just realizing that Ace of Base being such a profound voice in the early 90s for Euro dance pop, and that it sounds approximately nothing like what was happening in the 80s. It might have some markers back from the 70s if you want to think about the dance pop coming out of ABBA, for example, or really anything that was coming out of Eurovision at that time, there might have been some alignments there. I mean, I wasn't deeply connected to Eurovision in the 70s, 80s, or the 90s, frankly. So it's possible that what Ace of Base was doing in 1993 was pretty expected, but at least for people in the United States, people in the UK, it was kind of unexpected and slow. But then come 1997, so 4 years later, the track that we're going to talk about is Lollipop by Aqua. So you probably know less about this track and more about Barbie Girl, which was also on Aquarium by Aqua, in addition to many other, at this point, pretty famous tracks by Aqua. Aquarium is a very well-regarded Eurodance pop record from the 90s. It's pretty dense with hits and quality, and also a really excellent representation of what was happening with Eurodance pop in the mid-90s. So for those that aren't familiar with Lollipop, you might even want to just pause the episode in this moment and go listen to it, just so you can hear what it sounds like, because it kind of sounds like Barbie Girl. There's a few different extra things going on there, but has many of the same qualities. I mean, it is the same album, it's the same artists. So the fact that it's all pretty homogenous makes sense. So it shouldn't be surprising to you if you've listened to Barbie Girl more than one time. The thing that you can detect immediately is that although there are similarities to what was happening in All That She Wants, for example, using unnatural synth-derived instruments to create the musical backing for the song. So in All That She Wants, a really great example is the horns that they use in All That She Wants in no way sounds like real horns or oboes or whatever it was, the woodwind section or the brass section. It sounds like it was derived on a keyboard, which it may very well have been. It sounds like it to me. If it wasn't, then that's a surprise to me, but that's what it sounds like. And on Lollipop, there's even fewer natural sounding instruments that go along with the music. And it's very, very bouncy. It's fast. It's moving along. It's starting to sound more like Touch Me by Kathy Dennis. So again, dance pop and Eurodance pop have kind of flipped, where one was slow and the other one was fast, and now we're flipping and going the other way. So you can really get a really good flavor for what's going on and how that transition has happened between Ace of Base and Aqua in these 4 years, because the instruments kind of have the same ideas. Obviously, you can tell too that All That She Wants has a little bit clearer of a plot to it, where Lollipop is more fantastical and has less to do with something that's bound or grounded in reality. Like, there is a little bit of a sexy component to it, and it's a little bit dancey, it's a little bit fun. You could probably find this in the club if you were looking hard enough in the mid-90s. I'm sure that Barbie Girl and plenty of other tracks on Aquarium were finding their way into the Eurodance clubs in the mid-90s. I'm absolutely certain of that. But you probably wouldn't find as much of All That She Wants. So it's just interesting thinking about how they're connected, and yet the evolution is very clear. And then finally, in 1999, Venga Boys came out with We Like to Party, or The Venga Bus, which many people know it by, on their album, The Party Album. So this is just taking what Lollipop was doing and turning it up even more. It's even dancier. You're basically just finding it in the club. I'd even argue it's even dancier than Touch Me was. So it's very aggressively evolved off of first wave house music to arrive at this point. It's also why, if you were listening to the prologue, it was occasionally difficult to discern between what was house music and what was Eurodance music, because for such a long time, they really, really overlapped with each other, and it was hard to slice out what the distinctions and differences were. The real easy thing is that as it starts to go further and further along in the decade, and first wave house is left further and further behind, the Eurodance pop markers become more distinctive, because it's pop music for sure, because at least with We Like to Party by Venga Boys, it sounds very poppy. You can dance to it, but it's mostly not got the depth that even Everybody by Black Box had. It's even thinner than that. I mean, it's pop music, right? So it's even thinner than that. You're mostly dancing to it. You're grooving to it. It's fun. It's happy. So that's the distinction. And you could sort of tell that too across Eurodance pop is in 1993, All That She Wants by Ace of Base. That's a really heavy song. I mean, it's a really heavy, intense song that you can sort of dance to a little bit, but it's kind of a tough subject. I mean, it's actually serious, at least serious for pop music. But then as you go to Lollipop, far less serious. It's about a woman singing to a man about how she likes how sweet he is and wants to get with him and stuff. Like, it's pretty straight ahead pop music. And then in 1999, it's become even more basic than that. It's like, we like to have fun. So it's just stripping out details and information and depth more and more and more until it's just, we like to party. And that's it. So interesting how that trajectory changed, because I'd like to believe too that the depth of the other side of dance pop also probably was shaved down a little bit. I think, interestingly enough, that Britney Spears' Baby One More Time has a little bit more complex depth to it than Touch Me does, because it's all kind of going in the same direction, right? Because it's all pop music. But Baby One More Time, I think, has a complexity to it where the character that she's espousing to be in the song doesn't have a very high opinion of herself. And as a result, she's wanting to continuously get back with this person that seems to hurt her a whole bunch of times. Like, it's got more depth to it than Touch Me, which is, I met you, I like you, I want you to be in the club with me or be in a private setting with me and touch me all night long. It's interesting where the depth of these songs can take us, isn't it? Pop music. I think a lot of people often take it for granted, and if you really stop and listen to it and hear how these genres evolve over time, you might surprise yourself. So, having said that, now that we've talked about popular pop music, let's talk a little bit more about underground pop music, and we'll start with Jangle pop. So, Jangle pop, which you may recall back from the 1990 episode where we were talking about the Sundays and their album Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic, they were doing something that was approximately a not carbon copy, but like an 80% copy of what the Smiths and Morrissey was doing several years prior, because many consider Morrissey and the Smiths to have deeply innovated jangle pop as a movement, even if maybe at that moment they didn't exactly call it that, and it took a year or two for people to figure it out. But that jangly guitar that is played by the Smiths and that is often the backing for Morrissey becomes so very much of what jangle pop is, because it's pop music, but it's got a jangly guitar, and that's approximately what it is. There can be often a haunting component to it. It sounds a little bit indie, a little bit alternative, but the jangly guitars often gives it away 99% of the time. So it did have meaningful evolutions in the 1990s, which is why we're talking about it distinctly, despite the fact that they all kind of hang on the same guitar convention. It's interesting. So to start off with, let's talk about the Sundays, Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic, and the track is Here's Where the Story Ends, which came out in 1990, and we very much talked about it extensively in the 1990 episode of the podcast. So the lead singer of the Sundays is doing an excellent job mimicking, but then evolving off of the Smiths' ideas that happened several years prior. So she very much sounds like Morrissey, but she's a woman. So because of that, the voice is a lot higher. She herself does happen to have a particularly high voice. But despite the vocal differences, the intensity, the energy, it's all pretty much the same as what the Smiths were doing. The jangly guitars are very much there, especially where Here the Story Ends. We're getting all of that. And that's basically the reason why this is the first stop on our jangle pop journey, because it's pulling from what was in the late 80s and carrying it forward and doing a couple little things different that make it sound a little bit more alternative, a little bit more indie, a little bit more dreamy, a little bit more grungy, grimy than what the Smiths were doing. So it's a little less polished, and it's giving us something that's more 90s ready, because it's leaning more into like folk ideas. It's leaning more, like I said, into those indie ideas that eventually continue to grow and bubble and become so many of the other genres in pop music that we know and understand about the 90s. So it's just a really great jumping off point. So next, 4 years later, we've got Patience of Angels by Eddie Reader on her album Eddie Reader. This is basically just that next evolution. The jangle is still there. There's more folk components. There's more indie sounding ideas. There's more alternative pop ideas. There's more dream pop. So at this point, there's just more underground pop concepts and ideas that are coming out from other artists. And as a result, we're able to take what the Sundays did and integrate more of these other ideas into it so that it's just creating a stronger dynamic. Eddie Reader does a really great job on Patience of Angels, just very clearly articulating where that next wave of jangle pop is going, that we're walking away exclusively from where the Smiths were and even Morrissey. Morrissey is a distant memory at this point. And we're walking towards the alternative pop that is so very much in the zeitgeist of the mid-90s, of the mid-late 90s, late 90s. She's doing a really great job setting the tone for how jangle pop can be involved in that conversation. So you can hear between Here's Where the Story Ends and Patience of Angels, there are some alignments, and not necessarily just in the jangly guitars, but you can also hear those evolutions where the lead singer of the Sundays so much more so sounds like Morrissey, and Eddie Reader does not, just very much does not. So because of that, the evolution is clear, but the connection is also clear. And then finally, we end with Kiss Me by Sixpence None the Richer on their album Sixpence None the Richer. Pretty huge track. I don't know that people generally listening to it on the radio or have heard it a million thousand times would ever put this in the jangle pop category. They'd probably just lump it in with alternative pop and indie pop and what have you of the moment radio pop, because Kiss Me was all over the radio. It was obviously in the movie She's All That, so that's another huge plus for it because it was so very much in the zeitgeist of just teen pop culture. But the reality is that if you really listen, even in the very beginning of the track, it's got those jangly guitars again. It sounds more alternative jangly guitars, but it's jangly nonetheless. And you can really draw that thread between Kiss Me and Patience of Angels through that jangle, and even how Eddie Reader sings and how the lead singer from Sixpence None the Richer sings. There's connection points. You might even be invited to listen to Here's Where the Story Ends, and then Kiss Me, and then see in that 7-year gap what's changed and what's the same, because I guarantee you there's a pretty big overlap between those two, which is interesting because I'd like to believe Kiss Me is one of those songs that many people have heard so many times that they've stopped processing what they're listening to because they just understand it's this song and then they shut their brain off. But if you really sit down and listen to it intensely and then connect it up to these other two tracks, you can hear that it didn't come from a vacuum, that there was a very clear evolution off of the jangle pop sound over the course of the decade, and we arrived at this moment. So give it all a listen so that you can really hear and understand this meaningful trajectory for such a popular pop song in the history of the 1990s. So next, let's talk about dream pop. So dream pop was around before the 90s, and it was mostly around because of artists like Cocktail Twins. So Cocktail Twins, we talked about at length quite a bit during the late 80s, as well My Bloody Valentine, which certainly had bents of dream pop, but Cocktail Twins was really leaning into it. They understood where this was all going and how to make it poppy and less alternative rocky or emo rock or anything else that My Bloody Valentine was doing. So in the late 80s, Cocktail Twins were just doing their thing, coming out with really early stage dream pop. And when we say dream pop, it's haunting, it's very ethereal, there's real strong echoes in the music, and it's just very dreamy. It's certainly as if you're singing a song about a subject that one might find in a dream, but it feels like you're a little bit asleep and having a very feverish dream while you're listening to this music. So it's basically like pop music if you were asleep, sort of thing. So it's a little bit strange, it's a little bit unusual, kind of like a dream is, but it's also got pop hooks to it. There's pop melodies and things like that, so dream pop. So to start off with, we're going to talk about Cocktail Twins and their track Heaven or Las Vegas on their album Heaven or Las Vegas. It came out in 1990. So this, as I just said, is a continuation from what they were doing in the late 80s, and it's not substantively different or meaningful or a huge leap forward in 1990 as if 1990 was a prophetic moment in some way, because I think at this point we all kind of know that music doesn't really follow meaningful year milestones or time trends. Like time and music just happen to coexist with each other. I don't think people are thinking it's 1990, we need to do something drastically different. Like maybe some people do, but for the most part, everybody's just kind of doing their thing. So Cocktail Twins in this case in 1990 with Heaven or Las Vegas are just delivering their origination version of dream pop so that we can help ground ourselves in what comes next. And what comes next is in 1992, Bel Canto come out with Unicorn on their album Shimmering, Warm, and Bright, which we talked about on the 1992 episode of the podcast. And what Bel Canto is doing is taking ideas that were very shortly going to be Ace of Base ideas, so Euro dance pop ideas from the very early 90s, and it's still slow, it's still haunting, and it's still kind of ethereal, but it's moving forward from what Cocktail Twins were doing. They're adding a couple extra high-pitched voices to it. They're adding more harmonies to it. It's becoming even more ethereal. Some might even argue that it's becoming a little trip-hoppy and how it sounds like it's being played in a cavern, so that the dreaminess is only going up and up as these artists are learning how to use the synths better. So it's just becoming even more dreamy. And like I said, this is a short half step until you're getting into Ace of Base territory in Euro dance pop at the very beginning. So stuff that Bel Canto was doing, all they had to really do in order to get to Ace of Base was basically strip out all of that etherealness and just clean up and clear up the picture. So there wasn't Vaseline on the camera lens anymore to make things just kind of seem fuzzy and dreamy. You just strip all that out and just make it exactly what it is, and then you get Ace of Base all that she wants. So that's an interesting juxtaposition that you can hear in Cocteau Twins. It's a little bit more of that new wave synth idea where it's a little bit of that hopelessness, that a little bit of that pop punk idea that we were experiencing all throughout the 80s. And then Bel Canto is coming in and it sounds a little bit more hopeful and a little bit more positive dreamy and a little less like nightmare dreamy. And so that was just a couple years later. And then in 1997, Dubstar came out with Stars on their album Goodbye. So this is even dreamier. It's even more ethereal. It seems even fuzzier. It's even less clear, but the harmonies are going up. So the complexity of the music is going up. So despite the fact that it seems even more of a dreamy concept than Unicorn by Bel Canto was 5 years prior, it sounds more complex. Like there's more going on, as if these artists are figuring out how to throw more elements into it to make an even more complicated fever dream than what we experienced in the prior two songs that we referenced here. So Dubstar coming out with Stars. I mean, it took 5 years for us to get to this moment in which we're in this further wave of dream pop where the dreaminess is just going up and up, and it's sounding so very distinctive from anything regarding new wave. It sounds like its own thing. It also a little bit, again, sounds a little trip hoppy in that haunting sort of way. So it's just continuing to push in that direction. And then finally, we end with Renaissance Fair by Hooverphonic on their album Blue Wonder Power Milk, which we absolutely talked about in the 1998 episode. And Renaissance Fair is really interesting as a capstone because if you juxtapose that to Heaven or Las Vegas definitely sounds more new wave. It sounds much hazier and fuzzier than Renaissance Fair. Renaissance Fair sounds very clear. It sounds like it's got a very clear perspective, but is also still very fever dreamish. So it's interesting, as if the dream is becoming clearer for the dreamer, but what you see as the clarity increases makes even less sense. So I think that that's really interesting as an evolution for dream pop, that in the beginning, the point was to make it hazy and you didn't entirely understand what was happening because of how dreamy it was. Like you wake up from this dream and you don't remember what happened. And it just becomes more and more like a lucid dream as time goes on, where Unicorn, mostly still, you don't remember what happened. Stars, it's a little bit lucid, and then Renaissance Fair is just fully lucid dream. Like none of this makes sense. You're stumbling around in this world as is expressed by Hooverphonic in this track. It is very dreamy in nature. The musicality is extremely dreamy. There is a drama to it, as if you are having a dream that you're going through a roller coaster of emotions, kind of like what happens with lucid dreams, because nothing makes sense and your body's just trying to make sense of all this random information, and it's putting it in these interesting but probably not logical packages, which is why dreams are so interesting. And that's kind of what you come up with. So the trajectory that dream pop took over the course of the 90s is very interesting. That I'd like to believe the confidence about what dream pop was becoming stronger and clearer through the community of dream pop artists. And so their perspective was getting clearer and clearer and clearer. And as it was getting clearer and more confident, they were willing to strip away some of that, like I said, Vaseline on the lens to just show you what the dream was full force, and trust that the listener would be okay with the idea of whatever chaos they saw, because what they're showing you is still really intriguing and interesting and worth your time. And they're just more willing to show you exactly what it is. Even if they say, look at this doesn't make much sense, does it? And you go, no, it doesn't, but I'm here for it because lucid dreaming is fun. And that's kind of the trajectory of dream pop. So next, let's talk about alternative pop. So interestingly enough, defining this as alternative pop was very difficult for me, because alternative music, as you probably know, having listened to me on this podcast for this entire decade or this entire season so far, is I have a problem calling what most of pop culture calls alternative rock, because I perceive it to be more retro roots rock, neo roots rock. And then eventually it sort of turns into something that's a close approximation to alternative rock, but not really. And that too, there is this idea of neo-alternative rock, which was cycling back around to what Husker Du and REM were doing in the first wave of alternative rock, but just we're doing it again in a slightly different, more interesting way, right? Because all these things come in cycles. But for alternative pop, the trajectory was very interesting because it started off being a pop version of what was going on in the first wave of alternative rock, like REM, for example, and it just carried forward until it started to glom on to what was defined as alternative rock, in quote, but was the retro roots rock, neo roots rock ideas, but it all fed into this one food ball called alternative pop. And then it just kept going and became its own defined thing that people understand it to be known as alternative pop. So it's got a very strange, obscure trajectory that I think pop culture at large tried to define it as best they could, but it just ended up turning into this own weird definition that took on a life of its own. So when we say alternative pop, at least in the beginning, the way that we can think about it is if you took REM's first 4 albums and just tried to make pop music off of it, and that's where we start. So let's just start there. So in 1990, Trash Can Sinatras came out with the track Obscurity Knocks on their album Cake. And this is very much that idea where it's taking alternative rock music from the first wave and just making pop music off of it. It's just more listenable. It's got more pop hooks off of it. So it just sounds like somehow even more accessible REM, because I already find REM to be extremely accessible. This is just going even further in that direction. So it's very, very, very accessible REM music, let's just say. So that's a really good grounding for us. So next, let's move 4 years into the future. And when we move 4 years into the future, we start to incorporate some of those retro or neo roots rock ideas that came forward with, for example, Pearl Jam, that everybody started to call alternative rock, but was actually this other thing, because it's very obvious that Pearl Jam in no way at any point was purely alternative rock of any wave. It just wasn't. But when we get to 1994, Pearl Jam's already came out with their music, and the world of that style of music, and you could think about it like Dave Matthews Band, for example, that whole idea, I mean, that was also 1994. So by 1994, we had already morphed into alternative pop being this retro neo roots rock idea turned into pop music. And that's just what it's going to be going forward. So in 1994, Hootie and the Blowfish came out with Hannah Jane on their album, which is a fantastic album, Cracked Rear View. The thing about this album is that, first of all, Darius Rucker, his voice sounds so very much like the zeitgeist of alternative pop in that moment. Dave Matthews Band and Pearl Jam, like they all have that kind of Allman Brothers-esque sound to their voice that very much falls in that line of that neo roots rock idea, except they're doing pop music in this case, because Hannah Jane is very much a pop song, at least for the alternative pop bent. It's a fantastic song, by the way. It's one of my favorites for the entire decade, because Darius Rucker does an insanely wonderful job of bringing so much deep emotion into his voice as he's singing. It's almost unrivaled in the world of this kind of pop music, regular pop music, some even retro roots rock music. Like, he's really got a good voice and he really knows how to use it well. So Hannah Jane is, first of all, an amazing track, and I always love putting a spotlight on it. But just listen to the evolution from Obscurity Knocks to Hannah Jane. So even though the genre shifted considerably between those 4 years, because we went from sounding like REM-ish to now we sound more like Pearl Jam, there's still connection points in there. The guitars are still kind of the same. What they're singing about is still kind of the same. So it's still the ideas of alternative pop music, despite the fact that you made this huge shift in time and space. And you'd like to believe that what Hootie and the Blowfish, Darius Rucker, whatever, are doing is distinctive, and it was this total blow off the doors new thing. It wasn't. And frankly, I picked this song because it is a huge milestone in the history of alternative pop music. But even if I didn't, there was plenty of music that was happening between 1990 and 94 that incrementally got us to this moment. This just happens to be a clear platform for us to stand on to see a very obvious distinction in the evolution where there's a couple connection points, but it's just really aggressively evolving into this totally different thing. So it's a really fun jump, because we probably won't get too many of these over the course of this recap where the genre shifted so aggressively because of how the genre was defined initially, and then how it was defined not too long after because of other outside influences to the subgenre. It's just interesting. But next, just a year later, Alanis Morissette came out with Jagged Little Pill, and the track we're talking about is You Oughta Know, which is probably one of the most 90s defining non-dance pop tracks of the entirety of the decade. You Oughta Know was a totally defining moment in the history of music, in the history of rock music, pop music, alternative music, whatever. Folk music, some might even say. It was a defining moment. So Hannah Jane, totally amazing track. A year later, You Oughta Know. So the interesting thing about the evolution, just even in this 1 year time, is that where Hannah Jane had completely catalyzed so many of those aggressive shifts and pivots and levels of uncertainty that was happening in the evolution between 1990 and 94. By 95, whatever had happened with Hannah Jane, where it sounded a little bit more like Pearl Jam than it needed to, by You Oughta Know in 95 with Alanis, it was so distinctly its own thing, and it sounds like it's really leapt forward from where Obscurity Knox was in 1990 with Trash Can Sinatras. This sounds very different. Obviously, it's still pop music. The vitriol is so clear, where in Hannah Jane, there was just deep amounts of sadness that was happening, melancholy, or this idea that love doesn't work sometimes, and it's just kind of a broken thing, and people can be broken, and you shouldn't be hitching your star into somebody that's just sucking you into a black hole. And Obscurity Knox kind of has that bent too, where it's a little bit irreverent, it's a little bit sad, it's a little bit hopeful, it's a little bit hopeless. All of that stuff put together, You Oughta Know is kind of the same thing. There's all sorts of vitriol, there's all sorts of sadness and anger and charged feelings, but it's all pop music at the end of the day. So Alanis in this case is just carrying forward what Hannah Jane brought forward the year prior and just takes it even one step further. And then finally, in 1998, we get Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls on Dizzy Up the Girl. So this is just the peak. If you listen to what Obscurity Knox is doing in 1990 and what Iris is doing in 1998, there's some similarities, there's some alignments, absolutely. It's the same subgenre, but the couple waves that we've gone through in order to get to this moment, a lot has changed. It's still sad, it's still irreverent, it's charged with emotions and really intense, but it is pop music at the end of the day. And at the same time too, if you're thinking about, well, how does this in any way relate back to the neo roots rock ideas? It's got tiny bits in there, like the lead singer of the Goo Goo Dolls kind of sounds like Darius Rucker a teeny tiny little bit. Tiny. I mean, it's a different wave, so it's not going to sound totally the same, but it's in there. And could one justifiably say that this a little bit sounds like REM, but the emotions are turned up like 3,000%? Sure, you could get away with that. I think that connection point does exist. I mean, this is alternative pop at the end of the day. So that connection point is there. So isn't that interesting that if you go back and listen to Obscurity Knox in 90 and Iris in 98, 8 years across the decade, different ideas, they kind of go in similar emotional directions, but for the most part, the ideas that they were playing with are kind of different, aren't they? It's interesting. So finally, let's talk about indie pop. So the idea of indie rock, indie pop is interesting because I think we only talked about indie rock as an idea when we talked about the Blue Album by Weezer, and that was, I think, in 1994 maybe? And it was also off the back of Pavement doing some of their work in third wave alternative rock, and it led us inevitably to indie rock. But the idea of indie pop predates that. Like the sound of indie pop predates the Blue Album by Weezer. It predates a lot of the important evolutions that happened in alternative rock. Like there was markers of indie pop that went back to the very beginning of the 90s, which is super interesting. So then it begs the question, what do we mean by indie pop? And I'd like to believe that as you listen to some of the tracks I'm going to give you, you will start to hear what the indie pop sound is, or at least it was, all throughout the 90s. It had a different flavor to it that sounded a lot less like alternative pop or jangle pop or dream pop, and it was its own thing. So the track I'm going to start you off with is Not Too Soon by Throwing Muses on their album The Real Ramona in 1991. So one could argue that maybe this a little bit sounds alternative poppy, but if you listen to Obscurity Knox in 1990 and Not Too Soon in 1991, they don't sound very close to each other. They're pretty distinctive from one another, aren't they? I'd like to believe they are. And what you hear in this is that distinctive indie pop sound that you probably know or are more familiar with in a more catalyzed form, probably several waves later in the 2000s. Like if you think about Rilo Kiley, for example, that's indie pop to a T. So if you think about the idea that there were several waves of indie pop that came out that led to Rilo Kiley doing their thing in the early mid 2000s, just keep that frame of reference going. And if you're not familiar with Rilo Kiley, we will get there. I'm absolutely certain of it in season 3. But in this moment, just listen to Not Too Soon by Throwing Muses and then listen to Obscurity Knox so that you can get a frame of reference for what we're talking about around the beginning markers of indie pop. So then in 1995, 4 years later, Cub came out with New York City on their album Come Out, Come Out. This sounds even more so like we're going in that direction of the indie pop sound. Again, it sounds even less like what alternative pop or dream pop or jangle pop are doing. It's got a very specific twang in how the artists sing. It sounds a little bit folky, a little bit. The guitar work is a little bit more on the folk side, but not really. It's kind of like indie rock, right? Like in all of season 2, when we were talking about indie rock and alt country, how eventually alt country and folk rock and everything were going to start finding their way into indie rock. It's kind of the same thing where there's a little bit of a folk component, not really. It sounds a little retro folk, but not really. The guitar work sounds a little bit retro, but not really. It's just its own thing. And that thing is indie pop. So Cub is just moving the ball forward even further. They're catalyzing more so what Not Too Soon by Throwing Muses in 91 was putting together. So it's a more fully realized idea that's just pushing the genre forward and turning it into something distinctive and even more real than before. So then in 1997, Jill Sobel came out with Bitter on her album Happy Town, and she's pretty quintessentially a 90s indie pop artist. So she was very much delivering with Bitter in 1997. And this sounds like it's right in the middle, where it sounds a lot less new wave and a lot less 80s folk, and it sounds a little bit more 90s folk. There's a little bit of a punch and an interest there with the pop hooks. You know, it's even more melodic. It sounds a little bit more in your face and a little less, like I said, folky. So it's less folk and more pop, let's just say. So we're just moving that even further forward. And then finally, in 1999, Shannon Wright came out with You're the Cup on Flight Safety. And we talked about this album on the 1999 episode because this is an amazing album. Shannon Wright, to me, absolutely capstones the idea of indie pop in 1999, delivering so many distinctive ideas forward on what indie pop could be, because she's throwing out some grunge in there, post-grunge, neo-psychedelic rock. She's throwing folk in there. She's throwing alt country in there. She's basically throwing everything but the kitchen sink in there, but she's doing it through the lens of little micro moments in a folk track. It's really intriguing how she could just use these little inflections or affectations in her voice or how she plays the guitar that elicits all of these different genres in these different moments. And as a result, it's giving future indie pop artists about 1 million different pathways that they can take in order to better define some of these things, these little micro nuggets that she's playing with, and turn them into full-blown ideas down the line. So that's why if you start with Not Too Soon in 1991, by comparison, it sounds basically like 80s style folk music combined a little bit with new wave and a tiny bit of alt country, and it's all mixed together into this one package. And there's a little bit of pop in there, obviously, because it's indie pop. But then You're the Cup in 1999, it's just all of that to the maximum, still continuing to realize what all of these things could be and just weaving them together into these intricate little moments track by track. And You're the Cup just happens to weave, I think, the most of them throughout the entire album, which is why it's an impeccable track and a really great example for what we're talking about here. But it does all of those things in this one moment in time, and it elicits all of these questions that any artist who's interested in following in her footsteps would ask around what this could be, what it needs to be, and where it can go next. So it's an amazing way to express not just that so much of the 90s and indie pop was just this massive incubation period for what the full-blown, fully realized ideas of indie pop that we know it to be in the 2000s end up being, but that they were coming up with all sorts of amazing ideas and being super adventurous, even while they were all weaving into the same highly ambiguous lane. They were all around the same space, doing this in the same geography, in the same set of ideas in indie pop as it was defined in the 90s, but they were marching in a forest blind for the most part, and they were finding their way across the decade. And then by the time you get out to the end there with You're the Cup, there's about 100 different paths that Shannon Wright has carved out for potential artists into the 2000s, and say, whereas we were just stabbing in the dark, going through this dense forest, and we only had a passing sense of where we were going to go next, the forest has been cleared a little bit, and there's some very distinctive paths you could take here, and I'm showing you the way. So it's just very exciting. So having said all of that, I'm interested to hear what you agreed with and what you disagreed with. Did you agree with what I said about the different directions that dance pop and Euro dance pop took with one another? The one went fast and became slow, and one started slow and became fast, and how there was this weird inflection point where maybe in the middle they kind of sounded approximately the same in tempo, but we didn't necessarily get exactly there? Or did you agree with what I said about Jangle pop and how, despite the fact that we have all of these other subgenres of pop music, that Jangle pop was its own distinctive thing? Or was I reading into it too deeply? I think Jangle pop is kind of a well understood and well regarded subgenre. Dream pop, did I get that totally right? Do you agree with that? Alternative pop, do you agree with what I said about that? And then indie pop, right? I think that there's probably some contentious things somebody could say about indie pop as far as my impressions of it, where it started, where it's going, etc. What did I miss? I'd like to believe I hit everything that was meaningful about the entirety of Western pop music in the 90s with these 6 major buckets. I know that there's little tiny micro movements that happened because the 90s was super busy for pop music in the West. But I'd like to believe I didn't miss much, but I do acknowledge that there are some things that I didn't talk about here that you might find a track or two on my big list for the 1990s. So make sure that when I do drop that, you go and check that out because you might find some stuff that doesn't very clearly hit any one of these 6 genres, but is still meaningful nonetheless. What did you learn? Hopefully you learned something. Maybe you learned about that trajectory of the Euro dance pop thing, or maybe you learned something about Jangle pop you didn't know before, or the trajectory of alternative pop because it was such a thing that was on the radio at the time that I think a lot of people just listened to it and they didn't think about it that hard. So thinking about how it evolved over time and the connection points that exist between all this music, other than just being on the radio and being played 1,000 million times. And indie pop. Did you learn something about indie pop in the 90s? Hopefully. It wasn't a really well-known thing. It was more of an underground thing that started to bubble up in the 2000s only. So hopefully you learned something there. So as I said before, just as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I talked about in today's episode, make sure that you check out the Essential playlist that is linked in the description of today's episode. And please make sure that you join us again, because this is one of many in the series of recapping the 90s genre by genre. So make sure that you join us again, and make sure you rate us and comment too, because the more you rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us, the more that people will find it and thus listen and join our community. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod so that you know when we're dropping these episodes, because in this series, I'm kind of dropping them as I put them together. So make sure that you follow us so that you know when I'm dropping these. As well, subscribe wherever you're listening to us so that you get alerted every time we drop one of these. And when inevitably we start season 3, don't miss that. So subscribe. Make sure that you tell everybody that you know or don't know about what we're doing here, because I'd like to believe pop music is a thing that connects us all together for the most part, even if you don't want to believe in your heart of hearts that pop music is your thing or you're too good for pop music or whatever it is. Pop music is amazing, and it wouldn't exist if it didn't tap into something deep within all of us as people and connect us all up together, even if it's to connect with either overly dramatic, overly emotional ideas or thinly banal ideas that everybody can generally relate to, like sunny days, or how some people like cloudy days or rainy days, or being hurt in relationships, or really loving the person that you're with at the time. Like all of that stuff connects us together. So being able to bring people along in the journey and tell them about what we're doing in here just gives us more opportunity to talk with more people about all this music and better connect to one another about these things that just hit somewhere deep within us, even if we can't explain it. And to that end, the only way that we can get into those really deep parts is to realize that some of this stuff, even pop music that makes you feel things, even if by all accounts you're telling yourself that you can't like it because you're too cool for it. None of it's scary though, really. It's just pop music. Thanks for listening, everybody.